Hi, this is a instructional video on how to use DevSim 2.0, which is a game built primarily in Excel, but now ported over into PowerPoint to make it a bit more interactive and a bit more graphical. It's created by me, Mark Fabian. It's licensed under Creative Commons, so it's free to use. You don't have to give me credit, just don't take credit yourself. All the images in here are produced either by me, so like this is a photo from yonks ago when I was traveling in rural Indonesia, or they're drawn from Microsoft Office, like this icon here, or they're slavish reproductions of artworks that are more than 100 years old. So this is an example, and that means that there shouldn't be any copyright issues associated with using this for commercial purposes. I presume that lecturing at university is typically a commercial purpose, so you want to be careful about that. All right, so as I said, DevSim is created to teach development economics, created very much for a course that's about I guess the macro story of development. So I developed this while I was teaching at the Australian National University, and a big part of what we need to get across to students is how the Asian miracle took place, and then how China has developed and how Southeast Asia is developing in 2018. So it's maybe not so useful if your course is something more about like poor economics and the kind of microeconomics of development and NGO interventions and that sort of thing. But I think even for a course like that, this could be quite a useful sort of 1 hour background that gives the broad macro picture. So some of the things that we're going to look at are things like trade, resource, the resource curse, productivity growth, Malthusian trap, the agrarian transition, demographic transitions, that sort of thing. So we're going to try to give the whole narrative of development. The game is really easy to use, but it does require a little bit of practice, so I think it's worth watching this video from end to end and maybe having a go at it yourself a couple of times before you use it in a class. I reckon about an hour is kind of right for this game, but you can definitely get it done in less than that. I'm producing this instructional video just for anyone who wants to use the game, but also because I'm hoping to get a paper that explains how to use the game published. I'm going to start with the Journal of Economics Education. And so this should complement that quite nicely. So if you don't have that paper, then go and find it. It should be available on my personal website. So again, that's me, Mark Fabian. And I think it's probably available on Social Science Archive because that's where I usually store my stuff. Open science, woo! Okay, so when you start the game, you should just click on the slideshow. Right? So everything is done through the slideshow system. You don't need to use the sidebar at all. For the rest of this video, I'm basically going to just step through how you use the game, kind of pretend like you were a class and I was teaching you, but more just explain how, as an instructor, you can use this tool. I didn't use this as part of lectures. At the ANU, we have lectures and then we have these small group tutorials. I use this in the small group tutorials, but you could easily use this in lieu of a lecture. And indeed, the way the game is designed, it's not really about making really big choices all the time. It's more like the class makes some choices and that triggers teachable moments, and then you can ad lib for 5 minutes about those teachable moments. So it's quite a good aid to a lecture if that's how you want to use it. All right, so anyway, crack open the spreadsheet, the slideshow, I should say. These gray buttons are kind of littered throughout the game, but typically you don't need them. You just click anywhere on the screen and you're going to go through to the next slide. Okay, so this is the kind of very beginning of the game. You have this opening narrative. You're among 10,000 humans who are kidnapped by aliens and transported to a far-off planet for study. The aliens deposit you on a large island, something like New Zealand, with a temperate climate, no hostile predators, and abundant amenity. You will have to grow your economy to prosper in this new habitat. And then that brings us to this control screen. So the control screen is where you're going to be spending most of your time, and it's really what's giving you all the detailed information about how your little economy is going. There's also these buttons throughout the control screen that can take you to any part of the game. So if you click on the title slide, it's going to bring you right back to the start. If you click on the last slide viewed, it's going to take you to whatever the last slide you viewed was. So if the last slide you viewed was turn 3, and then you went back to the control panel using this button, then last slide viewed is going to take you back to that turn 3 screen. Okay, at any point you can click on this spreadsheet and it will open for you. And now you can edit it in Microsoft Excel. Okay, so this is the control panel. This is where a lot of the action is. The basic core of the game is just a Cobb-Douglas production function that's going to determine your income. So there are formulas all through here that are tracking various things. But the core of it is that your income is going to be determined by how many workers you have allocated to farming, manufacturing, and professional services, how many units of capital you've allocated to agriculture, farming, and services, and then your productivity over here. And your productivity depends on a whole lot of different things, mostly on these factors over here, which are mostly exogenous shocks. So these are going to be kind of narrative events that turn up in the course of the game that allow us to make various decisions, play out various key themes in development, and also are going to affect our little economy in various ways. We've also got this demographic profile over here that's very important, and that's one of our main sort of indicator variables. So besides income, we're also going to be tracking our savings. So savings is exogenously determined. It's just a portion of our income. That's going to leave us with investment funds down here, which we're going to use to invest in these different industries. And then we've also got our land. The game starts with us only having 1 unit of land, so that's our island. So that's quickly going to get overpopulated, and we're not going to be able to farm effectively because things are going to be congested. We've always got our workers. So workers are a subset of the population. The population consists of young people who can't work, old people who can't work, and then this big working age population in here. And we assume that the 19 to 36-year-olds are having babies while the 37 to 54-year-olds are just working. So every turn, we're going to be allocating our workers into farming, manufacturing, and professional services, mostly the first two, because professional services only turns up towards the end of the game. And then we're going to have to produce enough food to feed these dependent populations. So producing enough food is calculated for us over here quite nicely. This column with the function just tracks all the different variables that affect farm productivity. And so each turn we're going to be able to look down here and figure out how many farmers we need to produce the food we want, and then the rest will go into factory workers. A lot of things in the game aren't quite as realistic as they could be. So for example, we could have output prices for agriculture and manufacturing goods, but that would just make things really complicated, and the students would get bogged down thinking about what the optimal way of allocating their resources would be, and that's not really the point of the game. So all we do each turn is just kind of figure out how much food we want and then dump the rest into workers. But in the paper, I do talk about potential extensions to the game, and if someone wanted to introduce output prices or something like that, that'd be a really cool thing to add to the game. Each turn, you're going to put this GDP per capita number down here, and that's going to slowly populate this graph with your GDP per capita. All right, so that's kind of the basic setup of the game. After I've explained that to students, sometimes more briefly than I just did there, I'll just close that, and then we're going to start the game. So you can click down here on Game Start, and that brings us to the game start. So this is, as I said, a photo from Indonesia when I visited there as an undergraduate student. This is in the highlands of Flores, which is an island, 3 islands over from Bali. Really nice place, beautiful Caldera Lakes, gateway to Komodo Island, excellent manta ray snorkeling, highly recommend it. But the point of this photo is just to show you like kind of handicrafts, agriculture, and a fairly low level of development. So this is where you start at the beginning of the game. You don't have a lot going on. So we can click anywhere on the screen, but especially down here, and that brings you to the game start. And everything's going to follow this sort of process. So it's going to start with a picture that kind of sets the stage for this scene, for this turn, and what's exciting about this turn. And then on the next slide, you should have some instructions about what you need to play through on that turn. So here at the game start, turn 0, we have 10,000 population, because we're all kidnapped by the aliens. We're all skilled in calculus and essay writing. It's just a little joke. But all those skills are useless to us in our present circumstances. We're really bad at farming and we're really bad at handicrafts because we never learnt any of that in our first order educations. So our productivity is terribly low. We need to allocate enough workers to farming to feed our population, and the rest will go into manufacturing, and then we need to invest our savings. So the first 2 turns are really straightforward, and it'll just be you allocating things. I'll give you an opportunity to explain the basic mechanics of the game to the students while finding a few teachable moments. And then through the middle part of the game, the students get a lot more involved making decisions. All right, so end of the instructions, there's always going to be a button that says return to the control screen. So we're going to click that, and then we're going to allocate our workers and invest our savings. All right, so back there, we've got to open this Excel sheet. Boom. Okay, so we know we've got a population of 10. So we go down here until we find 10 or more, and that shows us that we need 3 workers to feed our population. So we've got 3 workers, and that means that the other 7 can go into the factories. And now we go to the turn count, and that's it. And you're basically going to follow that process every turn. It'll get slightly more complicated as we go, but we always start with the exogenous shock. Then we allocate our farm workers, allocate the rest to factories, and then we put the GDP per capita down here and flip the turn count. Okay, I might just change that over. It's probably better. Okay, so our GDP per capita at the start of the game is 1.74. And then once you've done all that, you can just close it down. Oops, we forgot something. Do you know what it is? We didn't invest our investment funds. So we've got 10 units of capital that we can invest into something. All right, so what if we put it into agriculture? Okay, now I usually appoint a dictator in the class just quickly. Potential icebreaker, I've usually got nameplates that people have with their names on them so I can pull people out really quickly. And you just ask them, how do you want to split your investment capital between these 3 industries? Now, oh, sorry, this should be a 0. Right, so we've got investment funds of 10. So try to encourage them to give you a fairly easy split, like say 50-50. So you put 5 in agriculture, 5 in manufacturing, at most like work in fifths. Sometimes the students, I don't know, want to be very precise and they're like, I want 65% in this. Don't worry about that. Just, you can ride roughshod over them. It doesn't make a huge difference. You certainly don't want students getting bogged down in thinking about what the optimal capital allocations are between things. It's not really consequential. Obviously, don't be rude, like make the student get involved, but also, help them out of a panic if they're really brain frozen about what they should do. Anyway, once you've allocated your workers, allocated your capital, put the GDP per capita down here, and then it's really interesting, so 4.5. So part of the reason why we've got a really high GDP per capita is because we only have working age people. Let's go to turn 1. Okay, now we see that our GDP per capita actually collapsed at the start of that turn, and that's because we had this huge population growth. But we don't worry about that for now. Once you've got the 1, just close this down, and you can see that the spreadsheet is updated in the background, and then we go to turn 1. And turn 1 is about the Malthusian trap. How interesting. Okay, click through. Malthusian trap. High fertility, 5 births per woman, leads to rapid population growth, but they're all dependents. Because of diminishing returns to agriculture owing to the fixed factor of land, you can barely feed yourselves. You are in the Malthusian trap. However, some entrepreneurial people are inventing while others are learning by doing. The resulting productivity growth might save you. Return to the control screen to allocate your labor and capital. So that last bullet point just kind of prompts you, the lecturer, to do what you need to do to keep the game rolling. But this early bullet points, the kind of narrative that's going on, that's really prompting you about your teachable moments. And that's really what the game's mostly about. So you might want to talk about high fertility. Why do we have so many kids? Maybe the reason why we have so many kids is because the adult population is worried that there's no pension system and no healthcare system. So when they get old, who's going to take care of them if they aren't able to feed themselves? They're going to need some kids to take care of them. But mortality is probably very high at this point, so they're going to need to have a lot of children to offset that high level of mortality. If you have a lot of children and you have limited land, You're adding all these extra workers to the land over time. That land's going to get congested. It's not going to be able to produce a high amount of food. And if you had more population and added more people to the land, they'd actually produce less food than they consume. And that's the Malthusian trap. And then you could talk a bit about the history of that if you want. And then you could talk about how we got out of the Malthusian trap through technological innovation and improving the productivity of agriculture. So that's our hope down here, right? But at the moment, our productivity is improving very slowly because it's only just people sort of tinkering and doing that sort of thing. We don't have good access to technological improvements. And as we'll see later, a big part of that story in developing countries today is that it's much easier to adopt technology from overseas than it is to come up with it yourself. So hopefully we'll have some opportunities to trade in the near future. All right, so we want to return to the control screen, and we're just going to be illustrating all of this. Turn to the control screen, click on this bad boy, open up our Excel sheet. All right, so we've got a population of 35. It's just there. If we go down this screen, we'll see that we need 10 food to feed our population because 10 workers, because 9 workers is only going to provide enough food for 34 people. So all 10 of our workers are going to be in farming. That means we've got 0 in manufacturing. And so now you'll see as well that because our income's really low, because everything's in farming, which is kind of low productivity industry compared to factories, we actually have -9 investment funds, which means that some of this investment that we made last turn, these 10 units of capital, is going to depreciate. This is an opportunity to talk about the depreciation of capital and the low productivity of farming, particularly in the early stages of development. So we're just going to drop that down to a 1. And now we've done everything that we need to do. So we talked through the narrative, we allocated our workers, we looked for the investment, we allocated our capital, that should be a 0. And now we're going to put this GDP per capita down here, right? So GDP actually tanked initially, and that's because we divided it by a huge number of new dependents. All right, and we move over to turn 2. Okay. So you can see that when you hit the turn button, a whole lot of things change. So that's mostly the exogenous things. So fertility is happening exogenously, just declining by 1 each turn. Productivity is growing exogenously, just through those people learning by doing and tinkering. And that's going to affect a lot of these variables. Later in the game, when more factors are in play, then there'll be a lot more things happening exogenously. But that exogeneity in the later turns is dictated by endogenous decisions that you make in the early turns. We're about to make one of those. So it's turn 2. We're going to close the Excel spreadsheet. We're going to click on turn 2. Okay, so turn 2's theme is trade and commerce. Your new neighbors. Fertility declines to 4 births per woman, but population is still rising rapidly, right? Because we have quite a lot of women. 4 births is a lot. GDP growth is fast because we have a high population, but GDP per capita is low. All right, the aliens terraform the planet. This is one of these exogenous shocks that we can use to illustrate something cool. The new land bridge brings you into contact with a neighboring island and its resident species, the Vulcans from Star Trek. Now, if Star Trek is hopelessly out of date when you're using this game, I'd suggest updating that to a more pop culture sensitive species that is known for being high tech. The Vulcans are few in number but technologically advanced. You could easily wipe them out with your large population, but they offer you a deal. In exchange for a quarter of your population in food each turn, they will trade you their advanced technology. You have 3 options. You can accept the trade, reject the offer but remain at peace with the Vulcans, declare war and take the Vulcans' land. So now's usually an opportunity to do some teaching, but I don't want to give too much away to the students about how these decisions are going to affect things, especially if this is a very kind of introductory class where the students aren't familiar with a lot of the themes. So you want to allow them to make mistakes, as it were. So I'd probably talk a little bit about comparative advantage. So if they're high tech, they don't want to be wasting their time with low productivity agriculture. So it's probably good that we produce the food and they produce the tech. But I wouldn't really go beyond that to talk more about trade. I'd probably say that if we take their land, that's going to reduce the fixed factor diminishing marginal returns stuff that's really hurting us at the moment and keeping us in the Malthusian trap. But war's pretty intense. So if we just want to be peaceful, we can go with this, but then we're not going to trade and we're going to be in autarky. So whatever the students choose, you've got these 3 buttons here. So this corresponds to the first option, accept the trade. It's a deal. Or we can reject the offer and remain at peace. So we're going to keep our farms going strong, or we can declare war. That's the military. Remember, this button down here just takes you back to the control panel. So whichever one you click, it's going to take you to another screen that's just going to give you information about what the outcome of that choice is. So if you choose open trade, then you have passive and direct transfer of goods, technology, culture, institutions, and tourists. So it's not just that you're trading the food for the technology, it's also that you now have kind of open flow of capital, probably also of labor in the long run, at least tourists, between your island and the island of the Balkans. And that means that you're getting a formal transfer of technology as part of your trade, but there's also going to be a whole bunch of passive transfer of culture and institutions and these kind of things, right, and ideas. And that's really important to improving productivity in the long run. So this is a good outcome. From there, you go back to the control screen and start manipulating things. But before we go that, let's just go through the other options. So if you choose to reject the offer but remain at peace with the Balkans, then we click the barn. And that turns us into a peaceful, isolated autarky. So we're going to have limited technology transfer in that situation because, we're not at war and maybe there's some tourists coming through, but we're not trading formally with anybody. So there's not a lot of FDI, there's not a lot of labor flows, and there's certainly not people bringing in technology to sell it in our country. This is a photo that I took in Bhutan. I'm pretty sure it's from Paro, which is where the plane lands. Bhutan's not a pure autarky, but it is quite an isolated country. So I think this is reasonably representative of this scenario. Bhutan's lovely, by the way. Everyone should visit. Great place. Okay, so then again, return to the control screen. And the third option would have been to declare war. So if we have a war of conquest, then we get more land, but we have lower tech growth. So we've got the additional land that we stole from the Balkans, but our tech's not growing, 1, because we didn't trade for it, and 2, because we can no longer passively adopt technology that we observe the Balkans developing and that their tourists and such bring over to us. All right, so every single class I've ever taught has accepted this deal. No one has ever done anything opposite. So let's click the trade, blah, 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 explain all that, go back to the control screen. Open up the Excel sheet. And with these exogenous shocks, where you want to look is this column here, column G. This is where we track all these exogenous shocks. So right now, we're at peace with the Balkans. So there's a 1 there instead of a 0. If we trade with the Balkans, then we want to turn that into a 1. Okay? If instead of trading with the Balkans, we had declared war, then we'd change peace with the Balkans to 0. And you see that our land went up to 2 when we did that. And so our farming became much more productive. Okay, when we trade with the Balkans, what happens? So the first thing is that our productivity goes up. So it goes up to 2.3 instead of being at 1.7. So that's quite a substantial increase in productivity. But our farm productivity seems to go down because we're giving away a whole lot of food to the Balkans. Okay, so that's basically the outcome of that. So now we just need to do the rest of the turn as usual. So we have a population of 85. So we've got to feed 85 people. That's going to take 19 workers. So we put 19 in the farmers column. And we've got 35 workers. So 35 minus 19 leaves 16. So those 16 people will be in the factories. So we're in a slightly better situation than we were last turn, where everyone was farming and we were really stuck in that Malthusian trap. So now we've sort of started to industrialize. We're still very agrarian. Half our population is in agriculture, but we're moving across more solidly to being focused on industry and manufacturing. Right, and then we've got 55 funds to allocate to investment. Now, just a quick note. So savings is cumulative over the course of the game. So remember that last turn we had 1, and this turn we've got 55 to invest. So 55 plus 1 gives you savings. Investment funds is just what you have to spend this turn. So it's always worth looking for investment funds rather than at savings. Right, so we've got 55, 1 in agriculture. Let's say we just split it again. So we go 25 into agriculture, so we end up with 26. And then that leaves us with 31 to put into 35, right? No, we put 25 in there, so 30. Whoops, 30 into manufacturing. All right, cool. allocated, did the exogenous shock, allocated the workers, allocated the capital, and now we'd go to turn 3, but first we just need to put our GDP per capita down here. Right? And then we go to turn 3. Done skidoodle. Exogenous things are happening. We've got a nice technological growth rate here because we're passively trading with the Vulcans. Fertility continues to decline. All right, let's have a look at what's happening for this turn. All right, so we go to turn 3. Turn 3 is about resource management. So here's a painting of some miners, maybe mining coal. Hopefully not anymore because climate change is real. Okay, so turn 3, not all gold glitters. Fertility is steadily declining, but population is still growing rapidly because of your large parenting age population. You're about to enter the demographic dividend. So if you want, you can just go straight back there and have a look at that in your demographic structure. In fact, you don't even need to open the sheet. So you can just look at the demographic profile there, right? So at the moment, you've got this sort of logarithmic shape to your demographic structure. So pretty large working age population, but also a lot of dependents. So it's not a bad situation to be in because we don't have a lot of old people, but we are feeding a lot of these useless mouths. Strong, useless mouths, but you get my point. Whereas in the future, if fertility keeps trending downwards as it has been, this bunch of people is going to turn into our working age population. They're going to have fewer kids, and then gradually we're going to have a huge working age population, not a lot of kids, not a lot of old people. And that's when we'll have really huge increases in our GDP. All right, and now you can use this last slide view to just go back to where you were before and go on with the narrative after you've gone through that teaching moment. So what's the exogenous shock for this turn? You discover a deposit of unobtainium, a rare and precious mineral. So unobtainium is from the movie Avatar, and again, you can change it to anything that you think might be more topical. The unobtainium is useless to you, but the Vulcans offer to buy it from you or exchange it for infrastructure. You have 3 options. Place the revenues in a sovereign wealth fund to earn interest, transfer the dollars to the population to use for consumption, or you can trade your unobtainium to the Vulcans in exchange for infrastructure. And that's going to give you a one-off corruption-free increase in productivity. So I usually take this opportunity just to talk about these things a bit. Again, you don't want to give too much away, but you kind of give some background. So you might talk about the resource curse for a while and talk about the fact that a lot of countries that have discovered natural resources have actually found that it hampers their growth, mostly through fueling corruption. And that sovereign wealth funds have been one attempt to improve the quality of outcomes in these cases, and they've been used reasonably successfully in places like East Timor, but sovereign wealth funds themselves are open to corruption and exploitation, especially if they're not set up in a transparent manner. And you can talk about things like keeping them in Swiss bank accounts so that they don't appreciate the local currency, but then once they're offshore, they're much easier to siphon out by corrupt officials. The transfer the income to the population, that's what's done in Alaska with their oil revenues, as I understand it. And you might think that, well, the population knows how to invest it better, or maybe it's their natural resources in a sense because it's part of their national land, blah blah blah. And then on this one, I usually talk about how China often makes these kind of deals where they say, well, we'll build heaps and heaps of infrastructure, including the infrastructure that allows the mine to function in exchange for a mining contract. In any case, again, whichever one the students choose, you just click on the button and that's going to take you to the outcome. So if we build a sovereign wealth fund, oh no, there's a civil war over corruption. But in the aftermath of the civil war, new institutions are developed. So a lot of teachable moments here, very dense slide. So you talk about corruption in sovereign wealth funds and resource management. You can talk about how that corruption will often spawn wars. So at the moment in Papua New Guinea, there's quite substantial unrest, if not outright civil warfare in the highlands around royalties that were meant to be paid by gas companies there. That it's a very interesting story. I won't go into it too much. The gas company is not necessarily the villain. It really seems to be more a case of patronage networks in the capital, really poorly affecting the proper payout of those royalties. Then you can also talk about the role of institutions in promoting long-run growth. and the fact that often improved institutions come out of abuses of power. So here we have the American story, and you could talk about that as a case study. Once you've taught everything that you want to teach, of course, you go back to the control screen and you start to adapt the Excel sheet. But before that, let's just go through the other options. So if you transfer the money to the population, what happens? So we've got people engaging in cultural activities, maybe their hobbies, going outside and walking and fishing or raising families, and some people just video gaming. So, well, as people are no longer strictly required to work, many people pursue their hobbies and other meaningful activities. So, labor productivity collapses. Well, that seems bad, but everyone's happier. GDP does not effectively measure these two things. So, on the one hand, it seems from a GDP point of view that unproductive labor is really bad, but we can quote Bertrand Russell, time you enjoy wasting is not wasted time. So what is this labor doing? And we could talk here about measuring productivity and the challenges that we face in that today and well, in the past and especially today, because a lot of things like how-to videos on YouTube aren't monetized properly, and also the fact that happiness and these kind of ideas aren't really captured by GDP. And so how do we measure development? How do we measure social progress? What is the goal? What are we trying to achieve? And so here I might talk about Amartya Sen's work and the capabilities framework and getting beyond GDP and this sort of stuff. Okay, and the last option in turn 3 was the infrastructure project, and this is the most straightforward, and I'd say the one most commonly chosen by the students. So infrastructure development leads to lower transactions costs. So here I talk about unpacking productivity. So you really want to talk about institutions in this term, and you can still talk about it here. So you say that productivity is mostly a function of technology and human capital, but then institutions, culture, and geography, and infrastructure. So in this case, we have infrastructure. If you have the bridge and you no longer need to swim across or take a boat, that's going to reduce your transactions costs. That's going to make your economy more efficient, even though you have fixed capital and labor. Although we can think of infrastructure as a form of capital. This photo is, I believe, taken from Nepal, just at the base of the Annapurna Ranges near Pokhara. So pretty low level of development place, but really good bridge, nice and solid bridge, which made accessing this area much easier, I have to say. Okay, so in any case, whichever one happens, you go back to the control screen. Let's do it as though they chose the Sovereign Wealth Fund, because that one's the most complicated. So if they had chosen infrastructure, you would just put one there, bang, and that's the end of the story. You go on with allocating your workers, allocating your capital, Dunsky doodle, no problem. If they do the resource transfer, same thing, just put one there and everything goes from there. So you can see that productivity has dropped substantially. That's because people aren't working on things that produce GDP. If they go with the Sovereign Wealth Fund, of course, you put a 1 here, but you also need to put, and that's sorry, when you do that, you'll see that income and savings go up substantially. And the reason for that is that the sovereign wealth fund's accruing interest, and that's factored in straight away. But you also have this improvement in institutions, so you need to put that down. But you're going to put that down. You can put it down now, doesn't really make much difference if you find that your memory's not so good, or you can wait till the start of the next term, because technically those institutions only come in after the Civil War. But just for the sake of simplicity, I usually just put it in now. You've got the institutions, you've got the sovereign wealth fund, but now you have to factor in that the Civil War really destroyed all the investment and all the capital for this term, right? So how are we going to do that? The first thing we do is we allocate the workers. So when there's a civil war, people are still involved in production. So we have a population of 160, which means we're going to need 21 farmers. This is a teachable moment in itself. Last term, we needed 19 farmers to feed a much smaller population. Now we have only 2 extra farmers to feed a population that's nearly double the size. Okay, so 21 farmers out of our 75 workers. So that leaves us with 54 people to go into manufacturing. Okay, and now you would have 293 funds to invest, except that there's no investment this turn because of the Civil War. And a lot of the capital that you already have is also destroyed by the fighting. So what you do is you go to the savings box here, and you put that down into destroyed capital. All right? And now you notice that when you go to income, income is a function of that destroyed capital. So destroyed capital is going to be subtracted from your income, right? Not such a big deal, but 350 is a lot. That was most of our GDP not so long ago. Okay, so you've put down 349 destroyed capital. That's the end of the turn. So you want to get your GDP per capita. It's pretty nice, isn't it? So we went from 3.23 to 6,000 in a generation. So we're really heading into the middle income range now. Okay, and fortunately, we've got good institutions. That's going to help us get through that middle income trap. That's something we can talk about now if you want as a teachable moment. All right, and then you go to turn 4. Boom. Close that down. Click on turn 4. Middle income. This is a photo from a fairly wealthy suburb in outer New Delhi in India, taken in 2016, I think. So you can see what wealth looks like. So these houses all had domestic workers. There's cars, which are quite common in Delhi relative to, say, the capital cities of Vietnam. But still a lot of mopeds, still a lot of people walking, people using very low-tech forms of construction, that sort of stuff. But it gives you a kind of vague sense of what middle income looks like. And middle income is a pretty respectable level of development. So click through. Middle income. So first off, still this demographic story unfolding. So fertility is now at replacement levels due to changing mortality and labour market conditions. Parents must make greater investments in their children so that they can secure unemployment, and that investment is likely to pay off because mortality has declined. So we're in a kind of the inverse situation of where we were at the very beginning of the game. The demographic dividend is in full swing. So we can go back to the control screen, and you see that here, right? So we've got a big working age population, still quite a few dependents down there, and a bunch here, but this is the beginning of the demographic dividend, and everything's really good. So we've got a lot of people working, not that many dependents, and soon these guys will be the working age population. If fertility keeps declining at the rate that it's currently declining, the next term we'll have huge working age population, almost no dependents, and that's going to be great, but then we'll have to worry about the demographic onus later. The other thing to maybe mention that I forgot last turn is just that we're now well through the agrarian transition. So of our population, or of our workers rather, only about a third are still in agriculture. The rest have moved across to industry. So that's like we've moved through that agrarian transition, and that's part of why we're now middle income. All right, back to the last slide viewed. What's the shock this term? So our society is now so complex, wealthy, and advanced that high-end services emerge as a notable part of the economy. So now you can do a teachable moment to talk about the role of the service sector in economic growth. So historically, we'd always thought, and there's some evidence to back it up, that economies went through this orderly transition from agrarian to industrial to service sector oriented. Whereas nowadays, it actually seems like the service sector often drives growth. So you have call centers, notably, particularly in a lot of African countries and in South Asia, but also just kind of low-level retail work is filling a lot of these gaps. And those are quite bad jobs. So we don't want to see a large service sector as necessarily a good thing if the quality of those service sector jobs is low. What we're talking about here in this bubble is quite high value-added service sector jobs like lawyers, consultants maybe, or bankers, scientists and R&D people, software developers, that sort of thing. Okay, so these guys have very high productivity. However, demand for their services is still limited, and so you can only have one professional for every 100 units of income in your economy. How many of these professionals will you employ? So again, appoint a dictator is normal. So I usually have a democratic vote to decide which choice people are going to make. So like in turn 3, these choices will be decided democratically, but allocating labor and capital and professionals, that's done just by a dictator. I just pull someone out of the class and say, how many do you want? So we go here. The smart thing to do is to allocate as many as possible, but students don't always do that because they say things like, bankers are evil and that sort of thing. But often they'll say, okay, so here the max would be 12. We're just short of 1,300. So we can't have 13, but we'll have 12 professionals. Make sure you allocate the professionals first, because any farmers, manufacturing workers, or capital that you allocate is going to increase your income, and therefore increase the upper threshold of how many professionals you can have. So let's say there's 12, and then we know that we've got 125 workers all up. We've got a population of 225. So we need to feed, we need 24 farmers. So a small increase in farmers to feed a much, proportionally much larger increase in population. So we've got 24 farmers, 12 professionals, that's 36 people. And how many workers do we have? 125. So that means that we need 89 factory workers. Okay. And then we're basically ready to go to the next turn, right? So we have no other exogenous shocks. You could talk about the demographic dividend if you wanted, but not hugely important. So look at our huge increase in GDP per capita, right? So really a nice acceleration there through the middle income period, in part because our demography has changed, right? So before we had our actual GDP hasn't increased a whole lot. What's just happened is that we have fewer dependents producing that GDP. And so we have each person feels much wealthier than they had in the past. Right, and then you can see our nice trajectory of GDP per capita there. So really positive story. Right, off to turn 5. So now you might want to talk about that demographic dividend a lot here and how it's giving way to a demographic onus. So we've got a big working age population, enormous, fairly small dependent age populations. That's really nice for our GDP per capita, but down the road, what's going to happen is that we're going to have a very small population of workers taking care of a very large population of old people. So that's the Japan problem, but at least Japan got old after it got rich. Whereas China, for example, in part because of the one-child policy, is really looking at a situation where it's going to be old before it's rich, and that might be quite painful for China. Right, so we close that down. We go to turn 5. Just a little bullet point telling you to tell the story that I just told, and then we have the exogenous shock. The aliens worry that your large carbon-intensive manufacturing sector is undermining the planet's fragile ecosystem. They try to wipe you out with a droid army. Beep, beep. You must fight a war of self-defense. If you have more than 3,000 income, you win the battle. And that's, you click that if you win the battle, else you're defeated. Click that if you're defeated. And then you want to check the control panel to find out how much income you've got. So we go back. We've got 4,000 income, so we absolutely crushed the threshold. And that means that we go back to the last slide we viewed. So we have more than 3,000. Victory! Huzzah! And we can go back to the control screen. If instead we were defeated, then it would be game over. So you only get game over if you choose autarky instead of trade, because trade's fantastic, especially for development, especially in Asia, which is where we were teaching. And then if you transfer the income to the population. So I'm very in favor of those kind of happiness promoting policies, but in terms of getting you a big military, they're probably not ideal, but that's probably a good thing because it's unlikely that we'll be invaded by aliens. Anyway, that's usually the end of the game. You can go back to the control screen and just kind of talk about everything that's been happening, how large our income's gotten, everything's improved over time, we're not farming as much, we've got these professionals, nascent service sector economy, blah, blah, blah. Once you're satisfied with the end of teaching, then you can just kind of close this. But one thing you want to do before that is just get it back to baseline. So one way to do that is to just have is to close it and not save. Another way to do it is to just have a copy and reload from the copy every time, or you can just remember what needs to be 0. So the first thing is to put turns back to 0, then you put workers back to 0, capital back to 0, and then you want all of these dummy variables to be 0 except peace with the Vulcans, because that's the default. Right? Destroyed capital also goes back to 0. And now you're back at the start of the game. Okay. Oh, down here we need to clear that out. Okay. And that's it. Once you got that, you just close it. Done skidoodle. Ready to rock. Close that down. Or you can, if you have another class coming, what you can do is just click this and go back to the title slide. And you'll be like, okay, class, today we're playing DevSim. All right, so I hope that was instructive and helpful. As I said, there's a document version of those instructions that you can follow, and I recommend sort of reading that while you play through the game without watching this video. Definitely have a couple of practice runs with the game, because if you get that spreadsheet wrong, it can be a bit of a disaster, and there is a few things you need to pay attention to. I hope this game seems cool. I hope you use it in your teaching. I hope it's as helpful for you as it was for me. If you have any questions, track me down. I'm currently between jobs, so I'm not sure where I'll be, but probably at Cambridge for the next few years, and then we'll see. So anyway, you can find my Google site or whatever I'm using and hit me up there via email. All right. Thanks very much, and see you later. Oops, got to close.